the general who believed he was immortal. Part 1 *. They told me early, in the language of medals and salutes, that I was forged for command. I believed them. I believed the sharp gleam of polished steel, the geometry of formations, the cadence of boots striking earth, and the way men straightened when my voice sliced the air. Belief is the cleanest weapon a man can carry. It is lighter than armor, sharper than a bayonet. It reduces the world to purpose and motion, and I carried it like a drum beneath my ribs, steady and unyielding. I did not see myself as merely George S. Patton, flesh arranged in uniform, bone hidden beneath brass. I felt older than that. As if the rhythm of marching had been carved into me before the 20th century learned to mechanize death. As if I had held reins, shields, spears, long before I ever learned to trace lines across maps. War did not greet me, I greeted it. I felt its pulse as a part of my own. Its smoke clarified me. Its fire purified me. Its silence taught me that presence alone could command. When engines roared, when tanks rolled forward like iron beasts over churned earth, I felt at home. The chaos did not disturb me. It ordered my thoughts. Every explosion, every whine of artillery, every shouted order was a note in a music only I could conduct. In battle, everything unnecessary burned away, doubt, fear, hesitation. Only the motion remained, and I became that motion. A general is not meant to question. A general is meant to make the world obey the weight of his certainty. I spoke with certainty because certainty obeys itself. Men followed, not merely because they trusted the plan, but because they trusted the sound of conviction. I learned early that authority is not rank, it is tone. The drumbeat of a voice that does not waver. I became that drum. I became the march. I became the echo that repeated across valleys and plains until the land itself seemed to move to my will. They called me ruthless. They called me brilliant. They called me dangerous. I accepted every name without resistance. Names are lighter than responsibility. Responsibility sat on my shoulders like armor, heavy, familiar, comforting. Armor does not ask whether the body beneath it can still breathe, it simply shapes the man who carries it. I carried it with precision, as if my muscles remembered the exact contour of the weight. And in that memory I felt the lineage of generals who came before me, their ghosts marching silently alongside me, whispering commands I already knew. I believed war was the natural state of man, and peace only an interlude, a brief pause mistaken for an ending. I believed that I had walked these lands before, not metaphorically, but literally. The frost that bit my cheeks in winter, the dust that scoured my throat in summer, these were not new sensations. They were old acquaintances, reminders of paths I had traveled in other uniforms, under other banners, in other centuries. Recognition, not pride. Familiarity, not comfort. Maps fascinated me, not for their accuracy, but for their arrogance. Thin lines attempting to contain violence. Symbols pretending to domesticate chaos. I would bend over them late at night, tracing routes with my finger, pressing my palm against the worn paper, feeling time compress beneath my touch. Past campaigns whispered through those lines. Old victories. Old mistakes. I told myself this was study. Preparation. But deep down, I knew it was communion. I was speaking to echoes that had never truly left me, and listening as they answered. There are moments in command when the world goes utterly still. Not silent, but still. Every man waiting, every engine humming, every breath suspended. In those moments, I felt absolute. Inevitable. As if whatever I ordered had already happened somewhere else, and I was merely remembering it aloud. Destiny is not learned, it is felt, as gravity is felt, pressing the body toward inevitability. I knew it intimately, like a pulse beneath my skin. I watched men fall under my command, thousands of them. Their faces did not leave me. They lined the corridors of my sleep, silent, waiting. I told myself their sacrifice had meaning. That history required payment. That progress demanded blood. These thoughts settled easily, too easily, in my mind. The gunfire, the screams, the smoke, they were not horrors. They were signals. Drums. Music of movement, of purpose. Civilization pretends it has evolved past such sounds. I knew better. I had heard them long before they had names. Victory followed me like a shadow. Not always clean, not always gentle, but constant. Success convinces a man that the cost does not matter. That the path is justified simply because it continues to open before him. I spoke often of honor, courage, glory, and I meant every word. Yet somewhere beneath those speeches, beneath the salutes and ceremonies, there lived a quieter conviction, that I was not passing through history, I was circling within it. Returning to familiar ground under new flags. Returning to patterns I had already learned, long before this century had written them. At night, when the camp settled and fires dimmed, I would stand alone and listen. Wind through canvas, metal cooling, distant movement. In those moments, I felt watched, not by enemies, but by time itself, testing whether I would finally recognize the pattern. I told myself immortality was not arrogance. It was duty. If I had been given many lives, then I was obligated to use them. To fight harder. To command without hesitation. To carry the weight others could not bear. This belief hardened like steel, quenched too quickly, and I did not yet understand that steel can crack. I marched forward, convinced that history needed my voice. Convinced that silence would only return once I had finished speaking. The drums continued. And I followed them, without question. The mornings no longer felt new. The smoke lingered longer than it should, curling like a serpent that refuses to die. I walked the same paths, traced the same roads, and yet each step whispered the same warnings I had learned to ignore. Men joked, repaired bridges, polished boots, and I watched them as if from behind a veil. Their laughter, meant to reassure, only reminded me that time was folding over itself, that every smile had been seen before, every cheer rehearsed in some memory I could not claim. Doubt crept in, slow and patient, like frost along the edges of iron. It is not a shout, not a storm, it is a whisper, a misstep in rhythm. And once it touches the mind, it multiplies. I remembered fields I had walked centuries ago, villages burned, banners torn. Names I could not recall, faces I could not place, yet their fear, their obedience, their silent pleadings, they resurfaced as if no time had passed. The men around me were not merely soldiers, they were echoes of those who had followed before, reflections of obedience and ruin stacked like corpses beneath the soil of memory. Maps became hallways rather than guides. Every line, every marking, carried not strategy but history repeating itself. I traced the courses of rivers, the positions of hills, and recognized them as if the land itself had been waiting for me to return. I saw Rome in every courtyard, Tripoli in every desert, Metz in every hollow. The war, I realized, had never truly ended. It was waiting in the folds of each landscape, in the rust of every cannon, in the hush of every encampment at night. At times, I could hear the drums before the battle began. Not the percussion of men, but a cadence older than memory. A summons from some deeper truth that no soldier can ignore. It pressed against the walls of my consciousness, insisting that the victories I celebrated were merely echoes of older wars, of lives I had lived and left behind. My certainty, once absolute, now quivered beneath the weight of recognition. Perhaps I had never truly led men to victory. Perhaps I had only repeated a pattern etched into my bones before I even knew my name. Sleep betrayed me. When I closed my eyes, the past invaded in impossible clarity. I saw cavalry charging across frozen plains, the hiss of musket fire, the burn of smoke in my lungs. Then tanks, then planes, then artillery roaring like distant storms. Faces overlapped, a Roman centurion and a soldier of Normandy, a cavalryman and a tankman, their eyes meeting mine with identical expectation. They did not ask for orders, they demanded them. And I realized the truth. My voice, my authority, my command was not mine alone. It was the echo of generations, a lineage I could not escape. The night brought no comfort. Shadows shifted unnaturally in the flicker of lamps. Canvas walls seemed to breathe. Sometimes, I thought I saw figures in bronze, kneeling or saluting, watching, waiting. They never spoke. Their silence was more accusing than any artillery. I would stand among them, and yet they were not present. I was alone, and yet not alone. The world folded over itself until I could no longer discern the beginning of my command from the end. And still, the drumbeat persisted. It was no longer the pulse of courage or strategy. It was the pulse of repetition, the rhythm of a life looped through centuries. Every order I gave, every movement I commanded, felt preordained. My victories tasted faintly of ash, my triumphs seemed borrowed, my men mere instruments repeating roles already played. The exhilaration of command dimmed. I began to question not the battlefield, but myself. Perhaps immortality is not the absence of death, I thought, but the persistence of pattern. Perhaps it is not escape, but an unbroken cycle, a relentless return. I had believed myself above mortality, unclaimed by time, and yet here I was, haunted not by enemies but by repetition. The same courage, the same fear, the same triumphs, the same blood, folding, overlapping, never ceasing. In the quiet moments, I spoke aloud. Not to men, but to the echoes. Do you recognize me? I asked. The wind whispered, the metal hummed, the campfire crackled, and in every sound, I heard the faintest acknowledgement. Recognition, yes, but not gratitude. Not relief. Only the confirmation that I was still bound, still a participant in a pattern that had no end. I began to see the toll on the men around me. Young faces, bright eyes, carrying the fire I had once held. They believed in their moment, their chance, their victory. And I envied them, for they did not yet see the mirrors behind every command. They did not yet hear the echo of centuries repeating themselves in the cadence of a drum. I wanted to warn them, to shout across time, but the voice faltered. Whose voice would they recognize, theirs, mine, or the ghostly lineage I carried? Every landscape I crossed began to feel like a memory rather than a place. Fields, towns, forests, rivers, some familiar, some strange, all entwined with the past. I recognized the soil beneath my boots, the slope of each hill, the pattern of every tree. Time had folded upon itself. The war I fought was no longer simply external. It was internal, a siege on my own memory, a campaign against certainty. And so I moved forward, compelled not by purpose, but by inevitability. The drums called. The echoes awaited. And I, for all my authority, felt the first tremor of fear, not of death, but of recognition. The pattern was endless. The cycle could not be broken. The general was not immortal in flesh alone. He was immortal in recurrence. I had not survived battles to rest. I had survived them to be reminded, endlessly, that history would always demand my presence, that memory would not release me, that the drum would never cease. The night deepened. The fires dwindled. The world held its breath. And I, at the center of it, began to understand that certainty was a fragile thing, that power was a chain, and that the weight of immortality was far heavier than any armor I had worn. The dawn revealed nothing new, yet everything had changed. The fog clung to the earth like a reluctant memory, refusing to disperse. I walked among the ruins of my command, and the world seemed to twist around me. Trees were taller, hills steeper, the sun sharper. Or perhaps it was I who had shifted. Time, once a straight line marked by orders and objectives, had begun to curve and fracture. I glimpsed shapes in the mist, soldiers, not quite real, not quite past. Moving in impossible synchrony. Their faces were mine, their eyes mirrors of the same certainty I once carried. And in them, I saw the first cracks of doubt widen. I remember standing at the crest of a hill, the wind tearing at my coat, the smell of gunpowder lingering. Below, the valley seemed to breathe, its contours alive with shadow and echo. And then I saw it. A legion of my own making, cavalry and tanks, chariots and motorbikes, swords and rifles, all layered atop each other like the strata of some unholy earth. They moved as I had taught them, obeying my hand, my voice, my invisible command, but they were not in my present. They belonged to every battlefield I had ever walked, every life I had lived. I could not touch them, could not alter their course, and yet their expectation pressed upon me as tangibly as the recoil of a cannon. The visions multiplied. In one breath I was atop a tank in Europe, the next I was astride a steed in Carthage. I heard the clash of metal, the scream of men, the roar of engines, the shriek of arrows. It was no longer sound, it was a language older than speech. The past and the present folded together. I saw the same victories repeated, the same defeats mirrored, the same blood spilled in endless permutation. My triumphs became rituals, my conquests mere rehearsals of something eternal. And in that realization, the armor of certainty began to rust. A bronze figure appeared, kneeling among the corpses of both men and machines. Its visor reflected my face, but older, sharper, colder. It raised a sword slowly, deliberately, a salute that carried no allegiance, no judgment, only recognition. I knew it was me, or some iteration of me, born of centuries, of campaigns, of inevitabilities. I wanted to speak, to assert that I was the original, the authority, the one who commanded, but the words faltered, swallowed by the echoes. I began to wander through landscapes that should have been familiar, yet were strange and alive. Forests whispered names I had not heard for lifetimes. Rivers carried the reflection of stars that had long since died. Villages burned and rebuilt themselves in the same motion, as if the earth were rehearsing the patterns I had imposed upon it. I realized then that my victories were not mine, they were the world remembering, the earth repeating, the ages folding themselves upon me like pages in a book I could not close. Sleep offered no refuge. In dreams, I was pursued not by enemies, but by memories. Armies I had led, faces I had commanded, weapons I had wielded, all surged toward me, silent but insistent. Their demands were not for orders. They were for acknowledgement, for recognition that I was both the victor and the victim, both the general and the ghost. I could not escape. I could not surrender. The line between self and repetition, between command and servitude, had dissolved. At times, I saw symbols carved into the landscape, crossed swords, shattered banners, the shadows of empires I had never known, yet somehow commanded. The soil itself seemed to pulse with expectation. The drum I had carried in my chest now beat not for courage, but for inevitability. Every step I took was a step along a predetermined path, every command a note in an endless symphony of conquest and decay. And in those moments, I understood the cost of believing oneself eternal. Immortality was not life unending, it was recurrence, it was repetition, it was a mirror that could not be broken. The general I had been was still here, and yet not. I was both present and ancient, both flesh and echo, both observer and participant in a cycle I could not escape. I screamed into the fog, a sound swallowed before it left my lips. No one answered. Only the wind, only the metal, only the faint, relentless drumbeat that carried the history of every war I had ever known, and every war yet to come. My authority, once absolute, now felt like a shadow. My certainty, once steel, now crumbled like rusted iron. The world itself seemed to question my presence, my command, my very being. I realized then that the war I had belonged to was no longer a war of nations or men. It was a war within myself, a campaign across time, a battlefield where I was both general and prisoner, both victor and vanquished. And in that realization, the certainty I had clung to, the belief that I was chosen, immortal, unyielding, fractured completely, leaving me exposed to the magnitude of my own recurrence, the unending echo of my existence. I walked alone through the remnants of a world I had built and destroyed. The roads were cracked, the trees bent like old soldiers weary from centuries of sun and wind. Everywhere I looked, I saw my own hand at work, yet it was a hand I no longer recognized. Statues of generals, monuments of victory, banners of conquest, they were mine, yet they whispered of lessons I had refused to learn. I felt the weight of every command I had ever given pressing upon my shoulders, heavier than any armor. The bronze figure returned, emerging from the fog, silent, patient, unwavering. It moved with the certainty of inevitability, and in its reflection, I saw not one life, but the sum of all my lives, the victories, the defeats, the corpses, the smoke. It knelt before me, and in that gesture, I understood that this was not an enemy, not a judge, but a messenger of truth. Its voice, when it came, was the voice of every era I had lived. "You are not immortal," it said. "You are unfinished." The word struck like a cannon blast. Immortality had been my refuge, my identity, my justification. And yet, in that moment, I saw the lie in my own reflection. I had believed myself eternal because I feared the silence that follows death. I had commanded because I could not endure surrender. And now, faced with the mirror of all my selves, I understood that the war I carried within me had never been about the world. It had always been about me, my obsession with being more than mortal, more than human, more than history could consume. The landscapes shifted beneath my gaze. Hills became trenches, rivers became moats of memory, villages flickered in and out of existence. I saw faces, soldiers I had led, men I had struck down, allies I had betrayed, enemies I had destroyed. Each one bore the same question in their eyes: why do you persist? And I had no answer, no command to give, no strategy that could silence their silent accusation. I was exposed, not to them, but to myself. I fell to my knees in the snow, the cold biting through the uniform I had worn for decades. I reached for the instruments of my authority, the maps, the medals, the pistols, the tanks, the echoes of orders shouted over gunfire, but they offered no counsel, no guidance. The past, present, and future pressed against me like a tide I could not hold back. In that crushing awareness, I glimpsed the true shape of my curse, not unending life, but unending responsibility, the endless chain of influence I could neither wield nor release. The bronze figure lifted its head, and I saw the eyes, my own eyes, filled with centuries of understanding. "You have been the architect of your own prison," it whispered. "Every victory has become a chain. Every life, a verse in the same hymn of ruin. End the march." The command was simple, yet impossible. To end the march was to surrender the only thing I had ever known, my authority, my purpose, my identity. The thought struck me with the force of artillery fire. Could I relinquish the rhythm of orders, the cadence of marching, the music of movement that had been the drumbeat of my soul? I wanted to protest, to assert that honor demanded continuation, that destiny was mine to command, that God had placed me above the frailty of men. But the words faltered, drowned by the cold clarity of inevitability. All around me, the armies of my own memory shivered in the snow. Soldiers of every campaign, every century, every life I had led, paused. They did not vanish, they did not attack, they waited, patient, expectant, as if the very earth itself held its breath. And I understood that the confrontation was not with them, but with the sum of myself, the eternal general trapped within his own obsession. I raised my hand, trembling, and the world shifted. The fog thinned. The snow softened. The echoes of drums faded. I felt, for the first time, the weight of surrender, not as defeat, but as acknowledgement. The bronze figure dissolved into mist, leaving only the quiet of the mountains, the stillness of the valley, the hush of a world no longer bound by my command. And in that silence, I glimpsed a freedom I had never known. Not the triumph of conquest, not the roar of victory, not the certainty of survival, but the fragile, aching grace of rest. The march could end. The drums could cease. The armies could sleep. And perhaps, I could finally step from the endless cycle of my own making and listen, truly listen, to the world beyond the echoes of my own voice. The dawn arrived not with a fanfare, not with the clamor of guns, not with the triumph of victory. It came as a pale whisper, brushing the snow-laden hills with a fragile light. I rose from the ground, my body aching from years, centuries, battles, and memories, yet somehow lighter, unburdened for the first time. The world had not changed, but I had. I moved through the manor, past the uniforms that once defined me, past the maps that had charted my conquests, and felt no claim to them, no desire to hold them. The air was thick with quiet. The wind carried the scent of frozen earth and the faint, lingering smoke of battles long past. I heard no footsteps but my own, yet each step resonated like a drum in the hollow of memory. Shadows clung to the corners, but they no longer bore accusation. The ghosts of my generals, my soldiers, my enemies, they lingered still, but they were no longer mine to command. They existed in the world I had shaped, but I no longer existed for them. I paused by the window, watching the snow settle over the ridges and valleys, softening the scars of the earth. Each flake fell like a confession, silent, pure, unassuming. I could see the ruins of past campaigns beneath the white veil, yet the whiteness did not hide them. It merely held them in gentle, deliberate suspension. Time, I realized, would not erase the wars, nor would memory. But it could soften the edges, dull the pain, and offer a stillness that even the most restless general could not have imagined. I walked to the stables, the silence of the abandoned machines welcoming rather than accusing. The tanks, the jeeps, the remnants of engines that had roared like beasts through dust and fire, they stood frozen, inert, their purpose fulfilled. I traced a gloved hand across the cold metal, feeling the echoes of movement, the rhythm of motion I had once equated with life. And I let it go. The march, the drumbeat, the certainty of command, all released into the quiet. Outside, the wind carried a faint cadence, a rhythm not of orders but of possibility. I understood, at last, that immortality had never been the preservation of flesh, but the persistence of influence. Yet I could choose to step aside, to let history breathe, to let the new generals, the new voices, carry forward what I had begun. My role was no longer to command but to witness, to remember, and to rest. I returned to the hearth, where the light flickered low and warm. I sat, pen in hand, not to record conquests, not to craft legend, but to acknowledge the quiet truth, that a life, even one stretched across centuries of memory and conflict, could end not with glory but with understanding. The world outside continued, indifferent, patient, vast. I was no longer its master. I was simply a man, seated amid the echoes of all I had been, listening to the snow fall, each flake a whisper of stillness, each silence a benediction. And as the candle guttered, and the last shadows receded into the corners of the room, I felt it, the fragile, aching weight of peace. Not triumph, not victory, not immortality. Only quiet. Only the slow, deliberate descent of snow over scars, over history, over me. And in that quiet, I rested. The drums had fallen silent. The armies had gone. The wind whispered through the manor, carrying nothing but the soft, unwavering echo of absence. I closed my eyes. The snow continued to fall. And for the first time in uncounted lifetimes, I was alone with nothing but stillness.